I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Raise your hand if you have ever been given a nickname before. Most everybody's been given a nickname before. If you are like me, you come from a family that is full of nicknames. My grandfathers on both sides loved to nickname everybody. And we all had nicknames. Some seem to make sense. Some have no idea what they're talking about. But that being said, I've got some family members who I'm pretty sure I don't know their real name because they've only been referred to by their nickname, and I have no idea what their real name is. What's interesting about nicknames is Jesus would sometimes nickname people. Jesus gave some people nicknames, and one of those people happens to be one of his best friends. We know him as Peter, but did you know Peter is not his real name? His real name is Simon. But what's interesting is if you look at John's account, it seems like Jesus calls Simon Peter from the moment they met. In John's account, in John chapter 1, verses 41 and 42, says, "He found first his own brother Simon and said to him, 'We have found the Messiah,' which translated means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, 'You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas,' which is translated Peter." From that point on, we see Simon being primarily referred to as Peter instead of Simon. From that point on. And what's interesting about that is we, at least at this point in Matthew's account, haven't been told why. We haven't been told why. And you think about that. Usually nicknames have a purpose, don't they? But up to this point in Matthew's account, it seems like Jesus and Peter meet, and he immediately gives him that name. And we're not told why. But the thing about that is, that's not really how nicknames typically work. Jesus had to have a reason, right? I mean, when you think about nicknames, typically nicknames are based off of something that you've said in the past or something you've done in the past, or maybe they're based off of something funny or embarrassing that happened to you, or maybe they're based off of some unique character trait about you. It's usually something. There's usually a reason for nicknames. Whatever the purpose may be, they always seem to have a purpose. And that's also true for Peter. But what's interesting about Peter's nickname, his nickname isn't based off of something that he had said or had done. His nickname was given to him because of something he would say, something that he would do in the future. Now that makes his nickname pretty unique and pretty interesting. And we're going to look in our text this morning at what Peter did to get his nickname. We're in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Matthew's goal with this entire account is to prove to the readers that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ. And now we have reached one of the most famous texts that bear out that goal. Right now we are entering into one of the major climaxes of Matthew's account. That's what we're going to look at this morning. Let's go ahead and jump into verse 13. "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?'" Now, Caesarea Philippi, on this map here, there's a bunch of lines that'll drive you crazy, but it's right here. You've got the Sea of Galilee right here. You've got about 25 miles north, you've got Caesarea Philippi. And in the Old Testament times, this region of Caesarea Philippi was a center for Baal worship, or we sometimes call him Baal, a very famous false god in the Old Testament. Later, this region was renamed Panaeus, and it was named after a Greek god that was worshipped there, Pan. And then, skip forward some more time, around 20 BC, about 20 years before Jesus was born, Augustus Caesar, he gave that region to Herod the Great, and Herod the Great built a temple dedicated to Caesar in that area, of white marble, beautiful temple. And then Herod the Great would die, and he would pass this region on down to his son Philip, and Philip would rebuild the city, and he would rename it in honor of Caesar and in honor of himself. Do you get where the name comes from? Caesarea, Caesar Philippi. So he named it after Caesar and after himself, and that's a typical thing for people who have pride problems to do. And so that's where we get this little area here. And while Jesus and his disciples were in this very, very pagan area, he asked them, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And the disciples at this point in time, they understand when he talks about Son of Man, he's talking about himself. Look at verse 14. And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Now, there were many speculations going around about who Jesus is, what his true identity was. Lots of people had different ideas, and the people were thinking, he's got to be a prophet. And that's flattering, right? Because the prophets were amazing people. That shows that the crowds, the people, they believed Jesus to be someone amazing. But they didn't quite realize how amazing, right? Jesus, though, isn't really concerned with what the crowds are saying, because his next question is this in verse 15. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Who do the crowds say that I am? Well, one of the prophets, probably. One of the prophets have come back, because the Jewish people, they kind of expected something along those lines. But who do you say that I am? This is the question that Matthew's account is really all about. Jesus wants to know what his disciples believe about him. After their time spent with him, seeing his miracles, hearing his teachings, who do they believe him to be? Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter, as he often does, he steps into the spotlight and acts as the spokesman for the apostles, for the disciples. And he unambiguously acknowledges Jesus' true identity. What is it that he said? He says, "You are the Christ. You are the Christ." Christ is just the Greek version of Messiah in the Old Testament. You are the Messiah. You are the anointed king. See, what the people of Israel were looking for years and years and years, God had promised a king from the line of David who would come and he would rescue his people. He would bring in a new era of renewal, of revival. He would bring Israel back to the top. All of these wonderful things this Messiah was going to do, and this is what the people were waiting on. And now Peter comes out and says, "You are him. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah." But he doesn't just say that. He says, "The Son of the living God." The Son of the living God. Now, we can say that, well, this points him to God. We know God was his father. He had a human mother and God as his father. Yes, that applies here. But also, take the history of this idea of Messiah. God referred to his anointed kings as his sons. What we see here is really a double statement, saying the same thing. You are the Messiah. This is what Peter, he's unambiguously saying this about Jesus. With absolute certainty, Jesus, you're the king. You are the king. And how exciting is that for the Israelite people? For us, we've known this for 2,000 years, but for them, they've been waiting for thousands of years for this to come. And Peter says it, you're the king. You're him. But here's a really interesting thing. Of all the places that Jesus could seek a confession of faith like this, why Caesarea Philippi? There's a reason I gave you a little bit of information about the city just a few minutes ago. Caesarea Philippi was a very pagan place. And it seems like from the text, Jesus takes his disciples to Caesarea Philippi simply to ask them this question. And then they leave. What's going on there? I don't think this is a coincidence. I don't think it's just a coincidence they happen to be here. Because here's what we know about Caesarea Philippi. It's a place that is known throughout history for its paganism, worship of other gods. And it's a place that's literally named after other kings. Jesus brings his disciples to this area and then asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" And what does Peter say? "You are the King, the Son of the living God." Living God, meaning the only one that's alive. In an area that is known for their emperor worship and for their pagan false god worship, Jesus brings his disciples here, asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" You are the only king and you are the only God. In the face of all of this emperor worship, all of this paganism, I don't think that's a coincidence. Verse 17, and Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Jesus pronounces Peter blessed. Peter has reason to be happy. You have reason to be happy. Why? Because flesh and blood, because humanity didn't reveal this to you, the Father did. God revealed this truth to Peter, I believe, through Jesus' ministry, through his teachings, through his miracles. Peter saw the evidence and he opened his heart to it. We know of people, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who have seen, we just looked at the other day, they have seen so many signs and yet show us another one to prove who you are. Peter has seen enough. I know who you are. You're the Messiah. God had revealed that, and Peter opened his heart to that evidence. He calls him Simon Bar-Jonah. Bar-Jonah means son of Jonah or son of John. And what's interesting about this is we see a balanced structure in this text. See, Peter, he addresses Jesus as the Son of God, and then Jesus turns right around and says, "You are the son of Jonah." And we're going to continue to see this balanced structure in this next verse, verse 18. "I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Since you, Peter, since you tell me who I am, let me tell you who you are. You are Peter." Peter means rock. You are rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church." Are we starting to see the connection here? We're starting to see that Peter received his nickname for a reason. And it has to do with what's going on in this text, of what he said in this text. Jesus' words here have been debated for centuries. And honestly, there are a lot of interpretations, four interpretations that I believe have a lot of truth to them. But that being said, I feel like it would be arrogant of me, because this has been debated by people much smarter than me throughout history. I feel like it would be arrogant of me to say with certainty what exactly Jesus is saying here. I will give two interpretations that I believe are most likely for what Jesus is saying, and you can study and decide for yourself which you believe is correct. But honestly, I don't believe they're mutually exclusive. I don't believe you have to believe one over the other. I think you can take both, because I think there's a lot of truth to both. Interpretation number one, the rock Jesus built his church upon is Peter. The rock that Jesus built his church upon is Peter. Now, here's the thing. I've been told my entire life I'm not allowed to believe that. And you've probably heard the same thing. I'm not allowed to believe that because the Catholics believe that. And you know, the Catholic belief, this has led to so many other beliefs down the line. But here's the thing. We should base our beliefs off of the Scriptures, not off of the beliefs or disbeliefs of other people, right? I think that's true. My belief shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter what other people believe. That shouldn't have any bearing on my beliefs. It should be the Scriptures. When you go to this passage and you let go of your biases, you let go of any religious baggage you may have, and simply focus on the structure and the wordplay of this passage, this becomes a very reasonable interpretation. Peter declared a truth about Jesus, and now Jesus is declaring a truth about Peter. Peter and rock are the same word. One's masculine, one's feminine. This interpretation would necessarily mean that Jesus is giving Peter some level of prominence amongst the church, amongst the disciples. And sometimes that scares us, but it shouldn't. Anyone who's read the first 5 books of the New Testament knows that that's the truth. Peter does have a level of prominence. You go to every single list of the disciples in the New Testament. Who's first? Peter, every time. You look at the first 10 chapters of the book of Acts. Who's leading just about everything? Peter. We don't have to be afraid to say that Peter had a level of prominence in the church. And here's the thing, we can accept the fact that Peter had prominence without having to go to extremes. There's nothing in this passage that says anything about Peter becoming the first pope or anything along those lines. This all leads to a very important point that I think is important for our Bible study, our interpretation of the text. Don't refuse to believe something just because another religious tradition believes it. That's a terrible way to arrive at truth. And don't believe something just because influential people in your own tradition have always believed it. It's another terrible way to arrive at truth. What we ought to do is try to release the religious biases and baggage that we have in our mind and just simply read the Scriptures in their context and interpret them accordingly. So that's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is this. The rock Jesus built his church upon is Peter's confession of Jesus' identity. Now, this is the interpretation many of us are probably familiar with, and I think there is absolutely a lot of truth to this. This would mean that Jesus gave Simon the nickname Peter because he knew one day Peter would make this bedrock confession. Jesus' church, his community of believers will be built upon, it will be established upon the belief that Jesus is the Messiah, and they will be a community of people who submit to his reign, submit to his rule. Regardless of the interpretation that you choose, the whole reason Peter is shown prominence in this passage is because of the statement that he made, because of what he said here. The point that we should receive, the point that should have our full attention here is Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of the living God. And this is the foundation that his community is going to be built upon and live upon. The end of the verse says this, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. The gates of Hades, the gates of death, it's sometimes referred to. It was a phrase used in the Old Testament. It was a phrase used in Jewish literature as well. And it referred to the power, the strength of death. Death cannot overpower Jesus' church. That's the idea here. Death cannot overpower Jesus' church. You see, we're going to look at next week, Lord willing, the rest of this chapter, chapter 16. And we're going to see that Jesus is going to talk about his own death. He's going to announce his own death. And then he's also going to tell his disciples, you need to be willing to die too. Here's what we see in this text. Even though Jesus is going to die, death can't stop the establishing of his church. Even though he will die, it can't stop the church. And even though Jesus' followers may die, death cannot overpower the church. Because what we see in Jesus, because of him, death is no match for us. Jesus overpowered death, and he's coming back, and guess what? because he's coming back, we will overpower death too. Look at verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Now, Jesus is still talking to Peter here. He's going to give Peter, this is a future thing, he's going to give Peter the keys of the kingdom. What does this mean? We can speculate about what it means, but I think Jesus tells us exactly what it means with the rest of the verse. Whatever you, Peter, bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. But what does that mean? What does he mean by that? Well, again, in Jewish thought, binding and loosing referred to what is required and what is not required. And here's the thing, this right to bind and loose is not given to just Peter. You go forward 2 chapters in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 18, and this right to bind and loose is going to be given to all the disciples. And so, do Peter and the disciples get to decide what is required and what is not required in Jesus' kingdom? No. No, the tense of the verbs here tells us the very opposite. What they bind and loose shall have been bound and loosed in heaven. Peter and his disciples will proclaim the decisions that have already been made in heaven. Remember, Jesus is king here. Jesus makes the decisions. As his disciples, as his citizens, as his church, we are those who share his decisions. We share his royal decrees with the world. Neither Peter nor any of us have any authority to bind or loose anything, require or not require anything in Jesus' kingdom. But we do have authority to share what he has required and not required. And it's important that we understand that, this distinction. He makes the rules, not us. We share the rules. We tell others about the rules. We tell others about what is required to be a citizen of Jesus' kingdom and what's not required. We don't make those rules, we just share them. The king is the one who makes the rules. Look at verse 20, last verse. Then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ. We see Jesus saying this a lot, and we ask, why? Why would this need to be kept a secret? Doesn't the world need to know that he is the Christ? Well, yes, the world does need to know, but not yet. Not yet. He's been telling his disciples many times not to go out and tell other people about maybe a miracle that he's done or this instant of who he truly is. Because here's the thing. The more people who know he's the Messiah, the more obstacles and the more trouble it's going to bring to his ministry and his mission. Think about it. He arrives on earth, and people know the Messiah is here. So at least some people know the Messiah is here. The king is here. And guess what happens? The local king wants to kill him. Because that's what happens. What we see is if more people knew that Jesus is the Messiah, his allies, people who are pro-Messiah, they're going to come find him, they're going to join him, and they're going to want to make him king. We've already seen them try to do that. They're going to want to make him king, and then they're going to want him to lead them into battle against Rome. And that's not part of the mission here. Those who are anti-Messiah, the enemies, they're going to want to kill him before he starts any trouble, claiming to be king and amassing a following and trying to do anything that might cause trouble there in the Roman Empire. And so, Jesus' true mission is not about amassing a great following and being a violent, conquering ruler. What we see with Jesus is he has come to suffer and he's come to die. And until that mission is accomplished, widespread knowledge of his identity is only going to invite trouble. People will know soon enough. It'll be spread to the entire world soon enough, but not yet. There's still more that needs to be accomplished. And so, bringing it into this climactic text here, I want to ask you this important question. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who do you say that Jesus is? Do you know there's some people in the world, they say Jesus never existed. I was listening to someone the other day, someone who's much more of an expert on apologetics than I will ever be. And they were talking about this topic, about Jesus, his existence. And he said, you'll see a lot of people online on the internet, they'll say Jesus never existed. He says, I guarantee you they're 15 years old, and they have no idea what they're talking about. All the experts, even the atheist experts, say Jesus absolutely existed. The evidence is all for that. Some people say he never existed. Some people say that Jesus was just a good man. No, that's not quite right. Some people say he's just a moral teacher. No, that's not quite right. But that doesn't really matter what other people say, right? Jesus didn't care about what other people say. I'm asking you as disciples and myself as a disciple, who is Jesus to us? Who do you say that he is? Here's the thing. We can be bold and confident like Peter. We can confidently and boldly say that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And if we do we mean it? Do our lives reflect that confession? Confessing that Jesus is our master and our king is confessing our allegiance to his kingdom, to his reign, to his rule, our allegiance to his will for our lives, that I choose to live according to the king's rules. But I'm afraid sometimes confessing Jesus has become like saying the Pledge of Allegiance. How many times have we said the Pledge of Allegiance in our lives and we're not even paying attention to what we're saying? Maybe we pay attention to what we're saying, but we don't really mean it. I think a lot of times we're treating our confession of faith to Jesus that very same way. Confessing Jesus as our Messiah ought to be something that has a powerful and a lasting influence on our lives. It means loving God, loving our neighbors. It means praying for the goodwill of our enemies. It means sacrificing our needs and our desires for the benefit of others. It means embodying the fruit of the Spirit. It means rejecting sin in all of its forms. It means being willing to die for our allegiance to him. And it means that believing that all of this is worth it because our King is going to come back and he's going to rescue and he's going to reward his people. Christianity has been done a lot of harm in the world, not because there are so many people who are refusing to confess their allegiance to Jesus, but because there are so many people who do, and they don't live like it. There are so many Christians who claim that they have given their lives to Jesus, and they're not afraid to shout it from the rooftops, but when you look at their lives, it looks nothing of the sort. And how much damage does this do to the message of Jesus when the world sees that? And so I'll end the lesson here. We as Christians, and there may even be some who aren't Christians here, what I'm asking is that we either commit or recommit ourselves to the King today. Recommit yourself to him. Be willing to openly and confidently confess your allegiance to him, and then live like it. Live like you mean it. Be different than your friends and neighbors. Stand out as a person who, no matter how you treat them, they're going to treat you well. They love their friends, they love their family, and they love their enemies just the same. They pray for those who hurt them. They have the fruit of the Spirit, something that you're not going to find in the rest of the world. Confession shouldn't just be a verbal thing. When we confess our allegiance to Jesus, it ought to be life-changing. I know it's easy to be the kind of people who say something and you don't really mean it, but it can't be this way with Jesus. Let's confess our faith. Let's confess our allegiance to Him, and let's mean it. Because when we mean it, it's going to change our lives, and it's going to change the world. If you have any needs this morning, you want to put Christ on in baptism, make that first confession that you believe Jesus is the Christ, and you're going to live accordingly. Today's the day to do it. You can have hope. You can have joy in your life, knowing that come what may, my King's coming back and things are only going to get better. And so if you want to be baptized into Christ this morning, we'd love to do that for you. If you're a Christian and you've not been committed to the King, recommit yourself, rededicate yourself to Him today. If you have any needs, you can see the elders in the back of the room, or you can come forward as we stand and sing.